because my co-author on this study is also leading a study that has results that have been completed. Dr. Anja Kurki, managing researcher at American Institutes of Research with long history or experience in this area, is going to share some exciting results next. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Candace. And before I get started, I really wanted to acknowledge some other members of our research team here at AIR without whom this research could not have been done. And they include Jessica Hebben, Seth Brown, and Doris Seidel as well. And I also wanted if
okay.
It's moving.
Sorry, you froze for a minute, Anja. Can you just start again for after you introduced your colleagues?
Okay. So after or before, can you help me out here a little bit, Lacy? Should I start from the beginning of introducing my colleagues, or just start with the presentation?
I think you froze after you introduced your colleagues.
Okay. So can I get the next slide, please? Okay, great, thank you. So research shows that students who are chronically absent are at risk for a host of negative short and long-term outcomes, from lower literacy and achievement to higher level of dropping out of high school, lower workforce participation, and a higher rate of substance abuse issues. Before COVID-19, about 8 million students, about half of which were in elementary grades, were chronically absent, which is typically defined as missing 10% or more of instructional days during the school year. Improving attendance has been a priority for states, districts, and schools for a long time, and it is even more so now due to COVID-19 caused increase in absenteeism. So in this study, which did take place before COVID-19, we developed and tested a low-burden adaptive text messaging intervention to reduce student absences in elementary schools. And we wanted to do text messaging intervention for the reasons that were mentioned before. Good reach, text messaging is flexible, it is inexpensive, and it can be complementary in a way that it can be used together with more intensive and expensive outreach methods. The theory of action behind the text messaging intervention that we developed was based on information, motivation, and behavioral skills, IMP model, which is often used in public health. And we identified 3 main factors that text messaging might address. The first one is information deficit. Parents might just not be aware or know what are the consequences of chronic absences for their students' progress. The second one is lack of personal and social motivation. It might be the case that parents just don't really know, or they don't believe the importance of school for their children's future. And the third one is lack of behavior skills. Sometimes, and I'm definitely one of them, I struggle to get my kids to school on time. So it's possible that parents might need some behavioral strategies to deal with that morning traffic hour and getting their kids to school on time. So we believe that if we could change this knowledge and this motivation and behavior, we might be able to have the students attending school more often. And if students spend more time in school, finally, we might be able to also have an effect on student achievement in the longer term. Next slide, please. So a few words about the study we conducted. It was a large-scale study. The implementation of the adaptive text messaging took place in the 2017-18 school year. The study included 4 urban school districts, 108 elementary schools, and approximately 26,000 students. Most of the schools in the study were Title I schools, and they had high level of pre-reduced lunch program eligibility, as well as high levels of chronic absenteeism. The student sample very much indeed mirrors the school level aggregate descriptives, but I wanted to emphasize two characteristics about the student sample. The first one was that 1/3 of the students that we had in the sample were identified at baseline as having a history of high absences, and we defined that as these students were already missing 10% or more of instructional days the prior school year, or they missed 10% or more instructional days during the first 4 to 6 weeks of the 2017-18 school year. The second characteristic I really wanted to kind of pay attention on this slide is the fact that 85% of the parents of the children in the sample had a working SMS phone number at baseline. As I mentioned earlier, the text messaging intervention that we tested was adaptive. The text messages parents received changed over time in response to the level of student absences. The intervention, as you can see from the slide, is somewhat complex, so I'm going to take like a minute or two to just kind of walk us through the slide. As I mentioned earlier, the text messaging intervention was implemented during the school year 2017-18. And at the beginning of October 2017, we started with what we call basic messaging, which included weekly preventive messaging sent out on Sunday afternoons, informing parents about importance of attendance and providing practical tips and resources for bringing kids to school. In addition to these weekly preventive messages, parents received a same-day notification when their child was absent. These same-day absence notifications were individualized, including the child's first name and the number of days the child had missed so far during that school year. In this study, we really tested two different approaches to basic messaging, providing information about the benefits of students' attendance, and that is positive framing. Or we tested the other way of doing it, the consequences of missing school, or negative framing of the information that we provided in these messages. So again, the basic messaging started in October, and at the end of the fall semester, we looked at the level of student absences. Those families whose child or student missed more than 8% of the instructional days during the fall semester would be assigned, in addition to the basic messaging, to one of the two intensified text messaging conditions for the spring: school staff outreach or goal commitment messaging. Parents whose children missed less than 8% of the instructional school days in the fall semester would continue to receive messaging similar to what they received during the fall semester. So the school staff outreach, really one of the intensified text messaging approaches, included a real person from the school or from the district, such as attendance counselor, sending messages to parents to get in touch with them about the absences that their children have, and potentially to refer these parents to additional appropriate services that the school district might provide. The initial kind of school staff outreach took place from January to March 2018 on a weekly basis until parents responded. And after the parents got in touch with the school attendance counselor, the conversation could move into a different mode. They could have phone conversations, they could meet at the school, there could be a home visit, whatever it kind of took to really establish that relationship and that communication. The goal commitment messaging was much more automated, and it included what is called a commitment device. Parents were sent a text on Sundays asking them to commit to bringing their child to school every day the next week. And at the end of the school week, parents would get a reinforcing positive messaging when they brought their children to school that school week. Next slide. And can you just click it through? Thank you. So here are just examples of the basic messaging, benefits of attendance and consequences of absences approaches. You can see how the messages actually would look that we sent out. And we have a message bank of a few hundred messages ready. Can you show the next one? And here are some examples of the school staff outreach. We provided this attendance counselors templates that they could use to communicate with parents. And the goal commitment messaging, this is an example of the initial Sunday message as well as the positive reinforcement message. All right, so the two approaches to basic messaging and the two approaches to intensified messaging together kind of forms the 4 adaptive interventions that we tested in the study. And I will just walk through the first one, which is dark blue. In the first adaptive intervention, parents received basic messaging about the benefits of attendance, the positive framing. If their student missed less than 8% of instructional days in the fall, they just continued with the same messaging that they got in the fall. Now, if their child missed more than 8% of instructional days during the fall, the parents were assigned to receive school staff outreach messaging in addition to the basic messaging. And in the same way, we have these 4 different versions of the adaptive intervention. We evaluated these 4 adaptive text messaging interventions using a within-school student randomization, and the study design we used is called Sequential Multiple Assignment Randomized Trial, which is SMART for short. And I will not go through the study design here, but if you are really interested to learn more about the study design and how we conducted the study, we do have a published final report that has a thorough discussion about the design, and I'm also more than happy to answer any questions that you might have to the question and answer section. But we should now move to the results. So, implementation. During the study, we sent over 800,000 text messages via a text messaging platform that was linked to district student information systems. Once the text messages were programmed to the text messaging platform, the accuracy of the messaging was close to 100%. That is, parents were pretty much sent the messages they were supposed to receive. Incorrect messaging most often meant that message was not sent when we were supposed to send one. For example, we may have a case where a student was missing school, but we could not send a same-day notification message because the data file from the school district student information system did not transfer on time to the text messaging platform. And as a result, we might not have been able to send a same-day notification text message. As I mentioned before, about 85% of the parents had a working cell phone number in the beginning of the school year. And we know that on average, about 74% of the messages that we sent were successfully delivered to local phone carrier. We do not know what percentage of the parents actually read the text messages. That's not information that is available when you do text messaging. But we knew that at least 74% of the messages on average were available for parents to read. As it is required by law, the parents were given an opportunity to unsubscribe to the text messaging that they received. And on average, about 12% of the parents unsubscribed during a school year. The level of unsubscribing varied by the study condition and was highest for the adaptive intervention that included consequence-framed negative framing, basic messaging, and goal commitment messaging as the intensive intervention. And this unsubscribe rate for that intervention, adaptive intervention, is about 20%. Next one. So this slide shows the results for the 4 adaptive text messaging interventions for the overall sample and for the sample of students who had a history of high absenteeism. The gray bar shows the level of chronic absence in the kind of the control condition, the business as usual condition, where the parents did not receive any text messages from the study. And the 4 colorful bars show the level of chronic absences for each of the 4 adaptive interventions. The first graph for the overall sample shows that all 4 adaptive interventions were effective in reducing chronic absence, and the reduction was from 2.6 to 3.6 percentage points, depending on the adaptive intervention. The second graph shows that for the sample of students with a history of high absenteeism, this would be a kind of at-risk, high at-risk skits. 3 out of the 4 adaptive interventions significantly reduced chronic absence, and the reduction was from 4.9% to 7.3% percentage points. The one adaptive intervention that was not effective for this subsample was the combination of consequence-based basic messaging together with the goal commitment. And from the previous slide, you might just remember that this was also the adaptive intervention with the highest unsubscribe rate, and this was not an effective intervention, this one arm. Next slide. So as a part of this project, we also conducted a cost study, and the cost of text messaging per students was similar to other informational interventions to reduce absenteeism in schools, such as periodical letters or postcards to parents, and significantly less costly than other more intensive evidence-based mentoring programs, such as Check and Connect. So this was really the first study that is a large-scale evaluation of an adaptive text messaging intervention to reduce student absences in elementary schools. The study did show quite clearly that texting parents about their child's attendance can reduce chronic absence. However, we just did this study during one school year, and more research is definitely needed to understand what are the results for a longer-term implementation. It is very much possible that parents might get more tired of receiving messages if they get them multiple years in a row, for instance. It was also very clear that once you got the text system set up, it worked quite nicely because it's mostly fully automated. And therefore, the overall level of implementation and the fidelity of implementation was very high. How high it is will really depend on the capacity of the school districts to kind of fix the system when it's breakdown, because sometimes the information from the student information system might not reach the text messaging platform, and the system have to kind of be restarted. And if the district has a good IT capacity, then the level of implementation will be very high. We also, as a part of the study, we developed a toolkit for school districts that they can kind of figure out how they could be setting up a system similar that we did in this study. And then finally, texting parents and informing them about their child's attendance is relatively low cost. The cost is similar to other interventions that are often used, like letters and postcards. And again, the actual cost of doing the text messaging will definitely depend on the IT capacity of the districts who would like to use this and what kind of systems they currently have in place for text messaging and what kind of student information system they currently have in use. And again, here is information about the study's final report. The final report is available in the Department of Education's website. And next one. And here is a little shout out for the toolkit for school districts. And again, this is also available in the Department of Education's website. And it helps mostly district leaders to think through all the steps that they would have to take in order to set up a text messaging system that was similar to the one that we implemented in this study. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja. A lot of great information about the study. So we did have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. And one of the first questions was there a difference between the text messages when a known planned absence occurred and had been reported to the school or the educator ahead of time versus text messages that were sent when the absence was unexpected and not reported?
So that is a great question. And we did not really make a difference between excused and unexcused absences because the theory kind of is like, it doesn't matter why the child is missing school, they're missing instructional time. It is definitely something that we would like to incorporate if there is prior knowledge why the student is missing. We also incorporated some of that information from the student information systems. For instance, if there were hardship code, there might be that student information systems had codes for, a family member passing away, a serious illness, and things like that. If we knew that the absence was due for any of those reasons, we basically stopped texting. But we were not able to do preemptive because the system was often not having that information in it, and we had to really rely on information in the student information system.
I see. Thank you. Okay, we have a few more questions. We have one question from Lori, who's curious to know whether texts were sent in the family's native language. And if so, how was that translation done? What was it? What kind of translation service was used?
Excellent question. We actually did translate all the messages to 9 different languages, and we covered the languages that were considered to be the kind of official languages of the school districts that they typically translated all of their communications with the families. So we covered 9 languages. We did, because we had the message bank developed in English, we actually used professional translators. So we were able to have really high quality translations of the messages done. So we didn't use like automated translation service like Google or something in real time. And we were able to identify which language to use, again, by using the student information system and the feature of home language. So we were able to match the language that the message went out to that information. We know that that's not always correct, and we were able to correct that when we got feedback from some of the parents saying that, you know, I know that the home language is Chinese, but actually I would prefer to get my messages in English. So we were able to then correct the messaging language accordingly.
That's interesting. 9 different languages. That's a lot.
It was a lot.
That's great. It's great. A lot of professional translators there. Okay, we have another question. Is similar. Someone that's curious if the teachers and or the parents generally seem pleased that the messages were being sent and received, or did they have any suggestions for improvements to the system?
We actually had, okay, a few things.
There's a lot there, right?
Apologies. So we did ask consent. Basically, we did a passive consenting. Lots of school districts actually already had requested consents from parents whether they can be contacted through text messaging. As a study, we also went to the extra step and we did what is called kind of informed consent, where parents were getting text messages as well as letters to school, and they could right from the beginning of the study say, I do not want to get text. So that was the first thing. And then at the end of the study, we held focus groups for parents who received messages to get their feedback. And most of the time, parents' feedback was quite positive. The one kind of adaptive intervention that got perhaps most of the negative feedback, and also where we had the highest unsubscription rate, that 20%, was really for negative framing or talking about the consequences of absenteeism together with the automated commitment device. When we were able to have that personalized relationship from someone from the school or from the district contacting the parents, that was clearly something that the parents really appreciated, that someone actually cared so much that they contacted them and wanted to have this conversation with them about their child's absences. So the feedback was mostly positive.
That's great. That's great. And then thinking about you doing this work across several school districts, are there, can you shed some light on any of the other kind of obstacles or challenges you faced in doing the study?
There were definitely some obstacles, and they are really related to circumstances that the districts had. We had one school district that had just changed their student information system, and they had really hard time to get their heads around how to use that system. So we actually had a hard time to do the programming that was needed to get the messaging going in an automated manner. So it really kind of depended partially on the capacity of the school districts and their kind of analyst and how well they were able to handle that. Some of the other kind of challenges were just how could we embed the text messaging, especially the school staff outreach, into different kinds of structures that district use. Some use school-based attendance counselors, some use district-based, and there were also combinations. So how would we be able to embed, instead of kind of creating additional work to the district, how we were able to embed this system into their existing systems was a bit challenging, but I think we were able to brainstorm and make it happen.
Great.
Candace,
did you have,
from the state context, there were challenges associated with trying to navigate everything that was happening at the local level that seemed to surface more through text than through email. People were less accustomed to receiving text messages from the state, and so just trying to coordinate all the local context made it more challenging than we, I think, even anticipated.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the things that we've been hearing. We also have a question around kind of the two-way communication piece about this, around did parents or families text back? Like what did that look like?
Yes, so when it was the school staff outreach, either like a real person was actually texting, we got about 30% of the parents actually text back, but that is an underestimation of the percentage of parents that actually got back in touch with the person who was in the schools, because occasionally they would come and visit the school, they would call them up, or they would just have a conversation otherwise in like parent evenings and so on and so on. But about 30% of the parents actually did pick up and text back to the school attendance counselors.
Yeah, it's a good percentage.
I was going to mention one more thing that's in the realm of text back too, which is that there were some concerns that we heard from parents that it was that it was like a hack, like they were concerned about clicking the link and following back up because of the phishing culture that we live in. And that was also not something that I had anticipated.
Yeah, and I think we got lucky in a sense because we did the consenting through text, and it started with this kind of informational messages to parents that this study is going to be taking place and you're going to be receiving these text messages. Please, click no if you don't want to participate in the study. So I think we just because we had, this was really a study, we had less of a concerns of parents thinking that the text messages were not valid.
Yeah, we also sent informational text. I think that
people get a lot of messages on their phone. We all get them. So it's like everyone's trying to decide if it's a real message. So that kind of brings me to one of the other questions that is coming up, and I think just some clarification around how the text messages were sent. Were they just sent directly through text messenger or through a specific app that needs to be set up?
So the study districts that we had, we basically worked with School Messenger, and that was the communication system that the district used for communicating with parents. And the School Messenger worked with us very closely, and they kind of built an extra module into their system so we could do the two-way messaging with the parents, for instance. So it was kind of customized for the study. There are multiple providers out there for text messaging that have similar capabilities that the School Messenger did in our study. But I always say, like, you have to be very careful in the complexity, what you're trying to put in place. Sometimes simpler is better than trying to do something that looks fancier, but it's harder to implement. So it's really important to really understand what the capabilities of the text messaging vendor really are, and then kind of go rather simpler and more effective and reliable messaging than trying something which is very complex and might be harder to implement and monitor.
Thank
the
you.
study that was in Arkansas also used a third-party vendor, but exactly what Anja said, it was very complicated to navigate. There were lots of available vendors, but troubleshooting how to actually implement the sending was a challenge.
Yeah, and one thing to say about that, because I don't want to scare people too much, one of the extra complexity that both Candace and myself faced in these studies is that it was kind of artificial complexity, because we were conducting these rigorous studies where we randomly assigned either students or families into different study conditions. And that made the text messaging much more complex, because different kinds of text messages needed to be sent correctly to different families in different conditions, which adds a great deal of complexity to the way how these messages need to be sent out. If you're just trying to send to everybody or to even certain schools, it's much simpler to implement than what we were trying to do in these studies.
And Anja, I mean, I know you mentioned the guide that was developed. So there's the guide that was developed as a companion piece to the study. And I imagine that guide gets into a little bit more detail about some of these technical issues and set up around establishing these types of interventions. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And it is really written from the point of view of both what should kind of the district leadership or people who are in charge of attendance policies think about and kind of go through the steps. And also it covers some of the, like, what should the IT or your student information system folks kind of think about when they are putting this system in place.
And then I think we also had a question around the analysis around costs per student. And the question is, are those costs mostly fixed, or does it depend on the type of message that was sent? Like how was that calculated, and what does that look like?
It's in this study, it was really mostly based on the cost of how much each text costs in itself, as well as what were the training costs for the school attendance counselors, what was the cost of their messages, their time, and things like that. So that the costs are really based on very careful kind of resource approach, where we calculated as many costs as we could include into the cost estimate. I would say that, you know, it is about that much that we said. It's just $6 to $8 per child per year is a pretty reasonable cost estimate, but it really depends on what are the existing systems in the district. That's really big if, and what are the capacities that the districts are already having in place for text messaging. Are they already using something like School Messenger or some other vendor that send texts, and how well their student information system can be linked to the text messaging vendor that they might currently use. So if that is really simple thing to get done, then the cost definitely goes down as well.
And I think we just have one last question, and I think this was related to the beginning of your presentation, Anja, around the assumptions underlying the intervention, and the assumptions that you stated up front around parents and caregivers caring or not caring deeply about their child's education, and those barriers and challenges related to attendance.
I don't think it's about caring or not caring about their child's education. I think all parents care about their child's education. However, there might be a lack of knowledge. That's the first thing. Like, you might just not be able to track. And again, I am a really good example of a parent who was not really tracking very well my child's attendance. So it was a surprise to me when I realized, oh my God, we have these like 11 days of school. How did this happen, right? So there's that kind of a tracking issue. Parents don't always pay attention how many days their child is missing school, and they might not know how important it is to have their child to attend school really regularly, because just missing a day and a half or 2 days a month gets you to that chronic absence throughout the school year. So that's one thing. The second thing is really about the motivational thing. And we do know that, parents come with their own educational experiences to these pictures. And if they had negative experience of schooling themselves, they might have different belief system and different motivational beliefs about how important education is for you, and how can we change those. The third one is, and I was, again, a good example of this myself. I missed the school bus a few times. Like, what are the specific strategies that you can have in place to really make sure that, for instance, you get the kids to school every morning? It is simple things like use the alarm clock, pack the lunch the night before, pick up the clothes, because the kids, if you let the kids to pick up the clothes in the morning, you might just miss the bus. So it's really educating parents who might not have all that parenting skills in place. So it's not about parents not caring, because I know parents very much care about their child's, well-being and progress. It's just that we are not all coming from the same circumstances to parenting.
Thank you, Anja. Okay, I'm going to shift us to the next section of the webinar, and we will have a chance to answer more questions later at the end. So thank you.